What's going on, boys? Today we are talking a bit about ENTJs and Machiavellianism. Now, if you mean Machiavellian the way people tend to use Machiavellian, as in the taking and keeping of power, then ENTJs are generally Machiavellian. But if you instead mean Machiavellian as the taking and keeping of power according to Machiavelli's writing and beliefs, then ENTJs are not Machiavellian. In starting my stillborn book selling business, I ended up with a copy of The Prince, and I took a lot of notes, realizing ENTJs do not possess many of these traits and do not use many of these strategies, despite being popularly affiliated with this term. Now, I have a feeling Machiavelli was an ENTP, and I found comparing his power moves to ENTJ's power moves provides quite a lot of insight into ENTJs, as they are, not as they are popularly represented. So we'll go down the list, hit some points, and discuss ENTJs. One of Machiavelli's earliest lessons is when you get power, change only what you absolutely must. If you don't change too much, the people won't perceive you as such a threat and will fall comfortably back into the routines they know. Now, from an SIFE perspective, that makes perfect sense. If you align yourself with the familiar, most people will take the known path of least resistance, giving you more time to secure your base. That is usually not the way ENTJs do things. If an ENTJ is moving on power, it's because they see something they believe needs to be done and requires this power or position to accomplish. Meaning, the moment they get it, changes are happening. They aren't stupid. They know this will cause a ruckus. But you need to remember, they are SI blind. And SI is not just a perpetual present. Even with FI SI types, there is a sense of what fucking with the SI order will change. Not just that there will be changes, but more specific changes. ENTJs are not inclined or maybe able to interface with that shifting of the balance, scrambling of the order. In an ENTJ's mind, if something isn't working, then it needs to be changed so it can work right. And any fuss this change causes will go away once people realize things are now better TM. And again, that is not to say that's a wrong approach. Many of the world's greatest leaders were ENTJs, but it's worth considering most humans are SI types, and comparing Machiavelli's approach to what you should do immediately once you get power to an ENTJ's approach demonstrates a distinction that gives us a little more insight into what's going on in ENTJ's noggins. Another one. People often reference Machiavelli's "it is better to be feared than loved." But that isn't all he wrote, that's not the entire sentiment. And people, in leaving out some very important parts, miss the point, misinterpret the point. The actual message, in essence, is you should try to be loved and feared. If you have to choose one, you should be feared, but under no circumstances can you let yourself become hated. And not being hated is an important point. He harps on it throughout the entire essay, or whatever you want to call it. It's good if you're loved because that makes your position more secure and your decisions easier to carry out. it's important to be feared because then people are less inclined to fuck around and have to find out. If you have to choose, it's better to be feared than loved because someone might ignore or screw around with someone they love, but they will not do it to someone they fear. And the most important distinction here is you can be feared, well feared, without being hated. And you need to avoid becoming hated because hatred overwrites everything else. Once you're hated, you will never be loved. You've ruled out one aspect of rule completely. And people might tread softly around you if they fear and hate you for a while, but you are inviting conspiracy or open rebellion because at some point, hatred completely overrides fear. And once people hate you so much, they are not afraid of dying, you're done. And ENTJs seem to have a partial understanding of this baked into them. ENTJs have models of how to make people like them and how to keep people from fucking with them. And they are able to develop these models because ENTJs possess an uncanny ability to determine people's capabilities and vulnerabilities. They are better than anyone else at figuring out the what. But they are awful at judging what someone might do and why they might be doing it. In fact, they tend to be unwilling or unable to watch a person's motivations unfold in front of them if they picked up on it at all in the first place. Meaning, their models normally work. So, if this FE thing even exists, it's not really a concern because it doesn't change anything. But it does, and it does because of hatred. Once an ENTJ thinks they can or need to and can get away with something, they'll do it even if they might realize it will make people hate them. Because they can, they think they need to, and they don't care or think they don't need to care. They believe hatred is another mechanism that can be managed or shifted with the right inputs. And they'll believe that up until the first person who hates them so much pulls the pin and metaphorically blows themselves up in an attempt to get the ENTJ because they hate them that much. Now, if an ENTJ survives this sort of encounter, they might learn from it. Most won't. It never ceases to amaze me how readily ENTJs will forget their mistakes when they believe they can manage the mistakes. The important point to note here is many ENTJs believe everything can be controlled with the right inputs. Machiavelli recognizes emotions can be manipulated but not controlled, especially not mechanically, especially not hatred. The third thing is consistency, an ENTJ's most beloved word. God, I just love putting things back where they're supposed to go so I never forget them. I love ordering the same foods from the same restaurants. I love hitching myself to one particular strategy and making small adjustments instead of adapting forcefully to changes as needed. Machiavelli recommends a ruler arrange themselves to rule consistently. So, you never look like circumstances, particularly unexpected circumstances, are forcing you to bend going against what you've set yourself up for. Nothing makes people hate a leader and view them as weak or incompetent as bending, changing for circumstances. Read my lips, no new taxes. And when Machiavelli says this, he does not mean a ruler shouldn't adapt. He even writes at length on how a ruler can adapt without looking bad. The key is, with intuition, logisticalizing for every single eventuality, so when you get the ball rolling, the likelihood of your having to change anything and look like you've had to change something you weren't planning is minimal. And that is a strategy I see most often in alpha quadrant types, SI and TI. And ISFJs and INTPs are better at this than ENTPs and ESFJs, but it's a pretty common thing with these types. Just because you don't see one of these types talking about a particular goal or explicitly planning around it does not mean it isn't there and it isn't happening. To be fair, you see the same long-term consistency thing in delta quadrant types, NFPs and STJs, but there is a distinct on or off with those types and their long-term consistency goals. I think that has something to do with TE, which we'll get to, but with TI-SI types, there is not an on or an off. If it's there, it's there. If it isn't there, it isn't there. This is sort of hard to explain, so I'll use an example. Let's say an INFP wants to become an astronaut. They flip the switch on, and then they take measured, specific steps to become an astronaut. Then they say, I still want to be an astronaut, but I'd rather do this. So they flip the switch off. And then progress toward astronauting doesn't progress, but that goal is still there. And when they flip the switch back on, then that progress continues. If an INTP wants to become an astronaut, without racking their brains about it too hard, they will, over the years, slowly move in the direction of astronaut and accumulate many astronauty things. So, even if something happens, there's never an instance they stop moving toward astronaut. That hiccup doesn't look like a hiccup. They had intuitively built in enough flex to get there even with hiccups and without seeming like they had been thrown off course. Now, ENTJs, despite being long-sighted, tend to be directly consciously engaged in and aggro about getting wherever they're going. They seem to like hacking their way through the bush to get where they're going instead of flying there on cruise control. Even when an ENTJ wants to look unconcerned by a sudden development, it will, for 5 minutes until they forget it, at least distract them, take their attention, and they will probably, even if subtly, do something about it. Try to get those inputs in and get control over it. And that is actually something you see in ISTPs too, in a different way and for different reasons. But anyway, ENTJs seem to take pleasure in these pop-up reflex puzzles, abstracted but real-life QuickTime events. These things can yoink their attention away from the long game. Things can provoke them, and they seem to like being provoked and getting the opportunity to fire back. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because you can become so dedicated to the long game You sit there with your dick in your hand for years while everything falls apart. But again, Machiavellianism here helps us understand ENTJs' drives, what they do and why they like doing them a bit better, instead of just slapping a vague, underexplained label on them and calling it a day. Now, there's a lot more, and there are actually a number of similarities between Machiavelli and ENTJs, but we've proven enough ENTJs ought not to be called Machiavellian, at least without putting in a little work to understand them better and not pigeonhole them so much. And maybe if you like them, figure out how you can advise them and help them overcome some of their blind spots. Plus, I am tired and sweating to death. So to summarize key ENTJ points aside from the silly funny framing, ENTJs are emotion blind motion incarnate. They're like cybernetic super soldiers walking into combat but not realizing their enemies have telekinesis. Yes, you're smart. Yes, you're capable. Yes, you're fast. Yes, there are a lot of ways to control a lot of things. But if you use the wrong inputs without knowing or without caring too many times, you're going to get yourself burned at the stake. And ENTJs are not Machiavellian, they're more Napoleon or Caesarian. And final thing, because I forgot, they are goal and priority driven. So if something doesn't fall under a goal or priorities umbrella, they will not be able to internalize as much of that thing as they may need to or may want to. So if you see them about to step on one of these landmines and they don't or can't recognize what's about to happen and you still want to help them, don't spit out information you think is relevant. Give them information that frames what you've perceived as a threat as falling under one of those goal or priority umbrellas. If they're worth caring about, tie it together for them. Then they will, or will be able to, if it's a brain thing, take it with the seriousness they should. That about rippity wraps this one up. I hope you enjoyed watching, because I certainly enjoyed making it. Like if you enjoyed, because it helps me out a lot. Subscribe if you haven't, because we do this shit sometimes. And comment your thoughts, because I love hearing from you. What do you think about this silly, funny framing device? I found it a fun way to demystify a little bit of literature while discussing a type I'm interested in. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Really, we have a lot of fun on this channel. So much fun, in fact, you can sweat all over it because it's hot. And it's not fun to sweat, but sometimes it is. That's how much fun we have on this channel, and I look forward to doing this with you guys again in the future.